It was 7 o'clock to 9 on February the 9th. Sorry. Thanks, Leoncio. Thanks. We're going. So welcome everybody to Radical Anthropology, and we're so happy to see lots of people in the class today, because last week was a real struggle trying to smuggle people through the lines, and hopefully we might get a few more people joining late as well. But thank you very much for coming on time in that window of time, because it makes things much easier for us to bring people through. So we do regularly in this term, this is spring, January, winter term, an intensive study of mythology. And last term, I don't know if you were here, but we had some fairy tale, which sort of stands in for indigenous European lost traditions. But of course, if we can go to other parts, and this week it's going to be South America, Amazon. Next week, we're going to go to Aboriginal Australia. Later in the time, we got some more fairy tale as well with Helenka Tujinska, who's Chris's colleague. But of course, those the ethnographies from Amazon and Australia give us a much more of a fleshing out of how the mythology is situated in ritual and its relationship with the cultures concerned. So Chris, I'm handing over to Chris to tell us about the bird Levi-Strauss's key myth from mythology, the bird nester, and an introduction to the science of mythology. Thanks, Chris.
So,
and you want to be in the camera, which is, that's correct, isn't it?
I have a memory of being a student who had supposed to be studying Russian at Sussex University in the 60s, and I was a bit lost. When I was at school, I loved mathematics, physics, and chemistry, and I actually got a scholarship from the Canadian Mathematical Congress to go to McGill University to study maths, because my family lived in Canada, and then we all moved back to England, and I did maths, physics, and chemistry at school, and all the time I was thinking, I love all this, but I also want something human. I kind of felt a sort of rawness about the sort of constriction that I was in to, sort of objects and energy and molecules and stuff. And I was told that the only way I could go to university and get out of maths, physics, and chemistry into one of the humanities was to study Russian for scientists, because then my science background and my arts future at college would be sort of, they kind of meshed together. So I ended up doing Russian. And all the time I felt, no, I'm not really interested in Russian language. I want to do other things. I'll cut a long story short by saying that I'd already sort of done my degree, and I was doing an MPhil, a postgraduate, and I read about this astonishing thing going on across the channel. There was a person called Claude Levi-Strauss. And what Claude Lévi-Strauss was doing, so I understood, none of it had been translated then, this was the 60s. He was applying the methods of science to all the things which scientists can't really discuss: art, music, religion, culture, all the things which I'd been trying myself to get into. And I found a copy in French of the elementary structures of kinship. And it was clear that what Levi-Strauss was trying to do was to find a kind of a simple formula, maybe on the model of Einstein's formula, E equals mc squared, a simple formula which would account for all the different range of complicated, sometimes very complicated kinship structures, systems of kinship and marriage around the whole planet. And what Levi-Strauss did in that early book, the elementary structures, was show how what seemed at first sight to be rather bizarre taboos about what you mustn't do with your mother-in-law and the kind of how in certain systems of kinship you have the man, like in Australia with an 8-section system, every man in that traditional kinship system, it has to marry, you have to marry your mother's brother's daughter's daughter, nobody else. Luckily, the category mother's brother's daughter's daughter includes a vast number of women all over the continent, actually, but only within anyone else, any other woman of your generation, that would be counted as kind of incest. And what Levi-Strauss managed to show was that you have a kind of almost a kind of plumbing system where in these complicated systems of kinship, women circulate this way, animal kangaroos in Australia circulate this way. You have a kind of system that everything's moving around, and the whole fabric of kinship has been connected up by these flows of men, women, animals, all in different directions. And the reason why there are certain taboos is to stop the flows going backwards or the wrong way, to stop everything sort of falling apart. In order to make sure that the whole thing holds together, men must avoid having sex with their own sisters, because men have to make sure that their sisters goes elsewhere. And in these complicated systems, all kind of can be understood as so many different expressions of a very simple principle of exchange. So just as Levi-Strauss uses this example, if you have a box of chocolates, the particular box of chocolates with all the ribbons and the decorations is there not to eat, just guzzle all by yourself. The whole point of having a box of chocolates is to make a gift of it. His idea was that the spirit of the gift, the idea that what you have in order to enjoy the pleasure of making a gift of it, that actually applies to relationships between the sexes. And so the reason we don't practice incest is because if you had incest, you wouldn't make connections. The whole point is that a woman should give away her brother to somebody else, a man should give away his sister to somebody else, and you get these systems of exchange. So that was Levi-Strauss's elementary structures. Levi-Strauss explains that his real aim in writing the elementary structures was to discover something universal about the architecture of the human brain. His idea was that the human brain, unlike a chimpanzee brain, has a sort of structure which governs these processes of giving and receiving. He worried after a few years that he hadn't really proved that this common underlying structure lying behind the world's kinship systems gave us a picture of the brain. He said the problem is with kinship is that kinship structures are mixed up with like real life, with ecology, with demography, with economics. People actually do have bodies and they move around in the real world and do things. So how do we know, he said, how do we know that the structures which you find if you make the kind of studies and comparisons that Levi-Strauss made, how do we know that these emanate from the architecture of the mind? So I'll just read them out. In Les Structures, he says, behind what seemed to be the superficial contingency and incoherent diversity of the laws governing marriage, I discerned a small number of simple principles, thanks to which a very complex mass of customs and practices, at first sight absurd and generally held to be absurd, could be reduced to a meaningful system. This is the overture, as he calls it, to the first volume of his work on mythology. However, there was nothing to guarantee that the obligations came from within. So see what he's saying? He's saying, if you study kinship, you can't be sure that the beautiful patterns you find emanate from inside the brain. They could come from outside. It could come from just the way in which, people have to organize things given circumstances, given the climate, the ecology, demography, blah, blah, and so on. So perhaps they were merely the reflection in men's minds of certain social demands that have been objectified in institutions. If so, their effect on the psychological level would be the result of mechanisms about which all that remains to be determined is their mode of operation. He's always, we were discussing this earlier, he always uses the longest possible sentences to make his thought extremely complex. But Levi-Strauss is one of those people who, during the early period of the Cold War, and I've written a whole book about this in my book on Noam Chomsky, but the whole point of the CIA's funding of all kinds of magazines and journals and forms of thought was to oppose the Soviet Union, and in doing that, oppose Marxism. And as everybody knows, I think, Karl Marx kind of invented, in many ways, the modern historical method, which states that the ideas in people's heads get in your head because of the way you lead your life. So the way in which people make a living makes them interact with each other, and their interrelationships with each other in the course of making a living, then find expression in the head. And that's called materialism. It means that the body is important, the way the body interacts with other bodies is important, and the ideas you have in your head aren't there simply because your brain has got a certain genetic architecture. The ideas in your head are put there by the kind of experiences you have ultimately in the course of making a living. So what happened was that in the early years of the Cold War, huge efforts were made in the West to turn Marxism upside down. So that instead of having an idea that the body comes first and the bodies interrelate with each other, you have basically mind over matter. Mind governs matter, ideas govern history, the head comes first, the body does what it's told, put it all the other way around. And so what Levi-Strauss was doing in that spirit was to kind of prove that kinship systems, but ritual systems and everything else kind of come out of the head, thanks to the way in which the human brain is organized. And part of that was the idea that chimpanzees have brains, of course, but they're kind of analog, they're messy, they're complex in a sort of messy way. But part of the idea was that the human brain is digital. So inside the human brain, unlike in a chimpanzee brain, you have on-off switches. Okay, incest, marriage, heaven, earth, contraries, flicked by switches, rather as language itself. The sound systems of language are human speech has a kind of digital format. So because Levi-Strauss was not satisfied that he proved that with his work on kinship, he turned to mythology. So he says, the experiment I'm now embarking on with mythology will consequently be more decisive. Mythology has no obvious practical function. Unlike the phenomena previously studied, it is not directly linked with a different kind of reality, which is endowed with a higher degree of objectivity than its own, and whose injunctions it might therefore transmit to minds that seem perfectly free to indulge their creative spontaneity. And so, if it were possible to prove, in this instance too, that the apparent arbitrariness of the mind, its supposedly spontaneous flow of inspiration, and its seemingly uncontrolled inventiveness imply, sorry about all this, the long sentences, imply the existence of laws operating at a deeper level, we would inevitably be forced to conclude that when the mind is left to commune with itself and no longer has to come to terms with objects, it is, in a sense, reduced to imitating itself as object, and that since the laws governing its operations are not fundamentally different from how it exhibits it in its other functions, it shows itself to be of the nature of a thing among things. Sorry.
Translate that.
Translate all that. He's saying, in a myth, anything can happen. You don't have gravity. You can just jump up in the air. You don't even have death. You can die and come alive again. You can, in a myth, anything can happen. It's all the normal constraints that you find in real life, all the constraints of physics, chemistry, biology, those don't apply in a myth because, hey, it's a myth. You can just say anything you like. And he then says, right, given that in myth, the mind is just communing idly with itself. In myth, your brain is just sort of imagining things, quite free of the real world. given that, supposing you find even on the level of mythology that laws, much like the laws of physics, still apply, only some things can happen, other things can't happen, then where do these laws come from? And he's saying, right, there's only one place they can come from. The innate genetic architecture of the uniquely human brain. It must be the brain itself which is imposing limits on what you can say in a myth. That's his argument. Right. Let's just think about this. It is true, and I was amazed as I read all this in mythology. It is true that in myths, not anything can happen. It's quite surprising. There are kind of laws or rules which are actually very surprising. One of the things which happened as I was learning about this, and I mentioned earlier, this evening class, the Radical Anthropology group, we go back to what is it, 1978. And I remember giving a talk on Levi-Strauss's bird myth, the first myth in the first volume. And one of my students from the back of the class, Max Pearson he told me about Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack and the Beanstalk, just so you know, is probably a Cornish version of the very same myth that Levi-Strauss begins with in his Mythologique. So Jack and the Beanstalk, you have the earth and you have the sky, and then you have a connection between the two. It's a beanstalk, of course. And up and down between earth and sky goes the hero, Jack. He goes up and down, up and down, up and down. And when he's up in the sky, he is hungry. Not only is he hungry, far from eating any food, he himself is the food of the giant at the top of the beanstalk. I'm pretty sure all of you have been to pantomime and you all remember fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman, okay? So the giant smells Jack's blood and wants to eat him. So can you see being eaten is the exact opposite of eating. You are the food, someone else is eating you, and in this case, you because you smell of blood. He goes up and down 3 times, and he comes down from the other world, comes down from this world where when he's up there, it's true that the giant's wife is kind to him, and she hides him in round things, which are rather womb-like. I mean, he's put in an oven or a huge big, big pan, and he's kind of safe there but he doesn't feel very safe because evidently the giant can smell his blood. But what he does is he runs down and he steals from the sky a treasure, and it's a goose that lays the golden eggs. It's the harp that sings, and it's of course he goes up 3 times and he has these 3 treasures and a bag of gold. And on the final coming down the beanstalk, the giant is chasing him down, and Jack, do you know what happens at the very end of it all? Chops the beanstalk down, the giant comes crashing down, and from then on, heaven and earth have been separated. You can't keep moving up and down between heaven and earth anymore because the beanstalk's been chopped down. Well, around the world, we have versions of that story. And in the more detailed versions, one of the consequences of the fact that you can go to the other world and come back, and go to the other world and come back, while the umbilical cord or the tree or the beanstalk is still intact, or the rope very often, if you can keep going to the other world and coming back, the other world is the land of the dead. Okay, so you die as you go to the other world, but you can come back. So death is not fixed. Death is not permanent. And the way I put it, trying to be more simple than Levi-Strauss, is this. There's a common structure to all the magical myths and fairy tales of the whole world. And it is this. You start out alive. And in this world, you have ordinary, everyday things going on. You have cooking. You can see what you're doing because there's light. You eat food, you have sex, all sorts of things. And this is this world, the world we all live in. And then triggered by what's often a flow of blood, but often something symbolic of that, something red perhaps, you switch from this world to the other world, the world of the dead. So you were alive, and now you're dead. And there's nothing magic about that.
What?
Nothing magic about that. And then comes the magic bit. You come back from the dead. That is magic. That's the biggest trick of all. The biggest magical trick you can have is to come back from the dead. And it's, I mean, we could discuss the trickster figure among hunter-gatherers. The trickster is the kind of, hunter-gatherers don't have God. They don't have Almighty God, this powerful despot, this patriarch. They have the trickster, who's a subject of fun and laughter. And his biggest trick is to die and come alive again. And when you think about dying and coming alive again, there's something, can be something comical about that. We've been to, Punch and Judy shows. I mean, the kids watching Punch and Judy, Punch throws the baby against the wall. Judy's very upset about it. She gets the policeman comes with a big crutch and bangs Punch on the head and he's dead. Oh yes, he's dead. He pops up again, he's alive again. All the kids laugh. So coming back to life from the dead is also a kind of trick in the sense of a joke. And honestly, what's missing from so many accounts of hunter-gatherer and other stories is the humor. So I want to stress that popping back from death to life is funny as far as people are concerned that tell these stories. Then so we have life, death, life, death, life, death. This world, the other world, this world, the other world, this world, the other world. Tell me, because all the world's myths, all these myths are also centered on what's often called cosmology. They're about the celestial beings. I mean, tell me the most obvious thing about dying and coming alive again. What is this thing in the sky which most clearly does that? The sun. Basically, back to shaking your head. Why are you shaking your head? Oh, the moon. Of course, they both do it. Both the sun and the moon do it. Now, across the world, I'm going to get to Levi-Strauss's bird nest in a moment. Across the world, we have, of course, ancient beliefs, crystallized in folklore, but of course, particularly in myths and fairy tales. And yeah, it's true that anthropologists are usually quite open-minded, Although we're supposed to be scientists, we also, we can have two-eyed seeing. We can say, yes, indigenous beliefs have their validity too. But you'll find there's a kind of reluctance on the part of people in my discipline, anthropologists, but also historians and social scientists and mythologists. There's kind of reluctance to take too seriously one particular indigenous belief. And that's probably the most universal of all indigenous beliefs, which has this magical connection with life followed death. And that is that menstruation in women has something to do with the moon. Now, you'll find enormous, absolutely astonishing, enormous resistance to that idea. Just look it up. Look at Wikipedia, look up a book on menstruation. You will find huge resistance to the idea that human female menstruation could possibly, in real life, have anything to do with the moon. I mean, never mind the fact that our word menstruation means moon chains, that all over the world as you menstruate, you're visiting the moon's your other husband, all these things. It's really important for a scientist to make really clear we're above all that stuff. Camilla was mentioning there was a program on the radio not so long ago it was about menstruation, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And what's the first, Camilla, tell us what the first thing was we had. You all need to know about menstruation.
Gabriella, who's only just finished her PhD with doing a lot of work on understanding of premenstrual syndrome, and she did a little podcast recording, which you can probably find online if you look for 5 things you didn't know about menstruation. It's Gabriella Conturides. And the first thing she came up with, the first image of the podcast was a beautiful, mystical full moon. And then it said, but menstruation's got nothing to do with the moon. And you think, well, why did you need to show the moon in that case? Why is that? It's like it's still there, like a haunting ghost, even so.
So menstruate, the first thing you have to know is that menstruation has got nothing to do with the moon. Which of course sort of could be true, couldn't it? Because I mean, you know, your cycle is varies in lengths. There's no way that everyone in the whole planet is synchronizing with the moon. Everyone menstruating at the same time at dark moon, for example. The length is quite variable. So when you're quite young in your teens, the cycle is going to be fairly long, quite a bit over 29.5 days. As you get older, it speeds up a bit. Still, the fact is that chimpanzees, our closest primate relatives, have a length of menstrual cycle of 36 days. Bonobos, equally closely related to us genetically, 40 days. Look at the range of primates. It would be more than the moon's length, less than the moon's length, quite varied, quite a scatter. Of all the primates, there's only one where the average length of the menstrual cycle is, guess what? 29.5 days. The length it takes for the moon to pass through its phases as seen from the Earth. And of course, I'm always told, Chris, don't worry about it. It's a coincidence. It's just a meaningless coincidence, which of course is quite true. It could be a meaningless coincidence. My point is always, don't dismiss it as a coincidence until you've explored whether there might not have been in the evolutionary past some adaptive reason for having a cycle of that length. One possibility being, of course, that we evolved in Africa, and the reason why we were a social creature, why we formed large groups compacted quite closely together, is to, as Robin Dunbar's pointed out, major climatologists, safety in numbers, because the lions are a brilliant night vision. They're quite lazy creatures, and they like to just eat you on a night when there's no moon. So you need to especially sing and dance and keep safe on moonless nights. And if you want to look for romance, traveling across the landscape, the safest time to do that is around full moon, which would then make sense that you ovulate around full moon and you menstruate around dark moon. I'm only just saying this quickly now. I'm not going to go into it all. It's just I'm just suggesting that we need to at least envisage the possibility that, if you like, indigenous wisdom across the planet has some basis in truth. Maybe there have been in the past some connection between menstruation and the moon, which would then explain all these ways of talking about things. I'm now going to read out the key myths. I suppose my little preamble there was to say, if there's some taboo in our own culture which stops you considering what I just mentioned, the link between menstruation and the moon as a possibility, supposing the world's myths about death and new life and presuppose that idea, that's the whole point of them, can you see why, if there's a taboo around mentioning that, it's going to rather stop you from understanding the myths, isn't it? I mean, if that's a taboo subject, you can't really go there because it's not scientific, and we've all got to be scientific. And the whole point of Lévi-Strauss's mythology is the science of mythology. He's trying to make mythology, the study of myth, a sort of conventional natural science, a science much like the rest of natural science. Nothing mystical about it, nothing airy-fairy, nothing emotional, nothing deeply meaningful, all that. It's just proper science, like looking at crystals or looking at stars. Can you see why, if the sort of core of all these ideas you're not allowed to talk about, or at least not allowed to take seriously. Can you see how that's going to obstruct any full understanding of the myths? Okay, I think I made my point. Right. He myth. The macaws and their nest. This is the #1 myth of Mythology, the first volume of Mythology, the raw and the cooked. Have I got time to read the whole thing out? It's 2 pages. I think I have. Yeah.
I would.
Okay, it's from the Bororo. Keke's arrived. Good. Everyone's here then. Fantastic. The Bororo Indians of central Brazil. The macaws and their nest. In olden times, the women used to go into the forest to gather the palms used in the making of ba. These were penis sheaths, which were presented to adolescents at their initiation ceremony. One youth secretly followed his mother, caught her unawares, and raped her. Okay, so young men need to be initiated. And this myth is telling us that women weren't very good at keeping their sons in line, controlling them through initiation, because here we have a woman whose own son took advantage of his mother while she was looking for a penis sheath and raped her. When the woman returned from the forest, her husband noticed feathers caught in her bark cloth belt, which was similar to those worn by youths as an adornment. Suspecting that something untoward had occurred, he decreed that a dance should take place in order to find out which youth was wearing a similar adornment. But to his amazement, he discovered that his son was the only one. The man ordered another dance with the same result. Convinced now of his misfortune and anxious to avenge himself, he sent his son to the nest of souls with instructions to bring back the great dance rattle, Bappo, which he coveted. So we have the nest of souls, which you could translate as kind of the land of the dead. And in the land of the dead, unlike Jack and the Beanstalk, where you find, a harp which plays itself, or a goose which lays golden eggs, you find this rattle, this great dance rattle, which is very valuable, gives you magic. The young man consulted his grandmother, who revealed to him the mortal danger that such an undertaking involved. She advised him to obtain the help of the hummingbird. When the hero, accompanied by the hummingbird, reached the aquatic region of souls, so the other world is wet, it's an aquatic region of the dead, he waited on the shore while the hummingbird deftly stole the rattle by cutting the short cord from which it was hanging. The instrument fell into the water, making a loud noise, jo. So we have the world of the dead, where this magical rattle, which makes a sound, is. The hummingbird seizes it, and it drops into the water and makes a loud noise. I just want you to bear in mind, we have noise and water and magical noise-making power. Alerted by this noise, the souls fired arrows from their bows, but the hummingbird flew so fast that he reached the shore safe and sound with the stolen rattle. So the father hadn't succeeded. His son is still alive. Moreover, his son's got, as a result of the incest, actually, he's got magical shamanic power. The father then ordered the son to fetch the small rattle belonging to the souls, and the same episode was repeated with the same details, only this time the helpful animal was the quick-flying juritu, which is a kind of dove. So that's the second expedition to the other world. Now we have the third expedition. The young man stole some butore. These are jingling bells made from the hooves of the kaititu, which are strung on a piece of rope and worn as anklets. So basically, noise-making instruments stolen from the land of the dead. He was helped by the large grasshopper, which flew more slowly than the birds, so that the arrows pierced it several times, but did not kill it. Okay, furious at the foiling of his plans, the father invited his son to come with him to capture the macaws, which were nesting in the face of a cliff. The macaws are these large parrots with brilliant red feathers, used in male initiation, which you have all these feathers to prove your status as an initiated man. But the macaws are nesting in the face of a cliff right up high. The grandmother did not know how to ward off this fresh danger, but gave her grandson a magic wand to which he could cling if he happened to fall. The two men, so we've got father and son, arrived at the foot of the rock. The father erected a long pole and ordered his son to climb it. The latter had hardly reached the nest when the father knocked the pole down. The boy only just had time to thrust the wand into a crevice. He remained suspended in the void, crying for help while the father went off. Our hero noticed a creeper within reach of his hand. He grasped hold of it and with difficulty dragged himself to the top of the rock. After a rest, he set out to look for food, made a bow and arrows out of branches, and hunted the lizards which abounded on the plateau. He killed a lot of them and hooked the surplus ones to his belt and to the strips of cotton wound round his legs and ankles. Do you remember I said, when you're in the other world, when you're in this world, ordinary things happen, among them cooking and feasting on roast meat and marital sex as well. In the other world, there's no cooking and you're going to be hungry. Okay? And I mentioned Jack and the Beanstalk, not just hungry, but if there is any food up there, he is the food of the giant. So here we have in the Bird Nester myth, the little episode which focuses on the hunger of the hero while he's in the other world, up in his, with the land of the souls. So he killed a lot of lizards and hooked the surplus one to his belt and to the strips of cotton wound around his legs and ankles. So he's got all these dead lizards around his middle. But the dead lizards went bad and gave off such a vile smell that the hero fainted. The vultures fell upon him, devoured first of all the lizards, and then attacked the body of the unfortunate youth, beginning with his buttocks. So they eat his buttocks off. Pain restored him to consciousness, and the hero drove off his attackers, which, however, had completely gnawed away his hindquarters. Having eaten their fill, the birds were prepared to save his life. Taking hold of his belt and the strips of cotton round his arms and legs with their beaks, they lifted him into the air and deposited him gently at the foot of the mountain. The hero regained consciousness as if he were awaking from a dream. He was hungry and ate wild fruits, but noticed that since he had no rectum, he was unable to retain the food which passed through his body without even being digested. He's got no behind. Everything he eats just goes straight through him. The youth was at first nonplussed, and then he remembered a tale told him by his grandmother, in which the hero solved the same problem by moulding for himself an artificial behind made out of dough made from pounded tubers. Oh, that's the solution. You should all remember this, by the way. If you ever find yourself on the other world and you're backsided beneath by vultures, remember this granny's advice. You know, make an artificial rectum and behind out of dough. After making his body whole again by this means and eating his fill, he returned to his village, only to find that it had been abandoned. He wandered around for a long time looking for his family. One day he spotted foot and stick marks, which he recognized as being those of his grandmother. He followed the tracks, but being anxious not to reveal his presence, he took on the appearance of a lizard, whose antics fascinated the old woman and her other grandson, the hero's younger brother. Finally, after a long interval, he decided to reveal himself to them. In order to re-establish contact with his grandmother, the hero went through a series of transformations, turning himself into 4 birds and a butterfly, all unidentified. So in all these stories, it's quite easy, actually, to turn yourself into all kinds of creatures, insects, butterflies, lizards, I mean, it's just kind of normal that you can change your skin, is the way it's put. On that particular night, there was a violent wind accompanied by a thunderstorm, which put out all the fires in the village except the grandmother's. Next morning, everybody came and asked her for hot embers, in particular the second wife of the father who had tried to kill his son. She recognized her stepson, who was supposed to be dead, and ran to warn her husband. As if there were nothing wrong, the latter, that's the husband, picked up his ceremonial rattle and welcomed his son with the songs of greeting for returned travelers. However, the hero was full of thoughts of revenge. One day, while he was walking in the forest with his little brother, he broke off a branch of the api tree, which was shaped like a deer's antler. So once again, he's turning into an animal, putting antlers on his head. The child, acting on his elder brother's instructions, then managed to make the father promise to order a collective hunt. In the guise of a small rodent, he secretly kept watch to discover where their father was lying in wait for the game. The hero then donned the false antlers, changed into a deer, and rushed at his father with such ferocity that he impaled him on the horns. Without stopping, he galloped toward a lake, into which he dropped his victim, who was immediately devoured by the buigoge spirits, who are carnivorous fish. All that remained after the gruesome feast were the bare bones which lay on the bottom of the lake, and the lungs which floated on the surface in the form of aquatic plants, whose leaves, it is said, resembled lungs. When he returned to the village, the hero took his revenge on his father's wives, one of whom was his own mother. To describe that myth as a little bit patriarchal would be an understatement, of course. Levi-Strauss points out a puzzle, which is that it's the young man who rapes his mother, who commits incest, who's the hero. He's the one who wins. And he comes back from the other world with the most coveted type of power, which is rain-making power. He gets summoned down the rains and it puts out everyone's fire except the fire of his grandmother. So the rainmaker has his shamanic power thanks to an episode of incestuous maternal rape. And Levi-Strauss points out that in all of his myths, there's always at the core of the story something which is labeled as incest. And what Levi-Strauss does, he sort of kind of recodes incest. He calls it excessive intimacy between kin. So from a patriarchal standpoint, if a mother is too close, from the patriarchal standpoint, too close to her son, you denounce her as having sex with her son. If a boy is too close to his mother, that's really worrying. It's probably some kind of incest going on. So there's this idea about incest. But whilst that's true, while there's this idea that excessive blood intimacy with your own blood is incest, is kind of a wrong, that in no myth, I would say, probably, I would actually say this, and I think Levi-Strauss would say the same thing. In no myth is the good way to get magical power to have sex with your wife or husband. There's no story which says marital sex gives you ritual power. It's always got to be, if you like, the wrong kind of sex which gets you to having power. I wanted to just accentuate again just the point about how these things connect up. Look, what Levi-Strauss finds out through mythology, through all his stories, is that certain things are sort of interchangeable with each other, and other things are absolutely not to be confused. So the things which can be exchanged for one another or can blur into one another are noise, with wetness, with blood sort of kinship intimacy, hunger, darkness, rawness. All those things can go together. So there's like a realm which is in the dark, in the wet, with the blood, with no cooking, no light, no fire, and therefore no feasting on red meat. And quite a few other things. Did I say noise? Okay, smell as well. The smell of blood is going to be there. So there's all those things kind of go together, and they belong in the world of the dead. And then there's another lot of things which go together, and those are kind of the opposites. So the opposite of noise is some kind of calm or maybe musical sounds. The opposite of incest is, of course, marriage. The opposite of the raw is the cook. This whole volume is called The Raw versus the Cook. Those two, raw and cook, they're just labels for these two opposite things. And they all go together. And what's amazing is that the storytellers never make a mistake. They never seem to get it wrong. So Levi-Strauss is onto something. How is it that these things all go together? If it was true that in the myth anything can happen, why don't the storytellers just make you go to the other world and eat roast meat? Why don't they just make you go to the other world and have with marriage in heaven? Why don't they make like lots of noise when you're having a wedding in the middle of the wedding ceremony? Why don't they have people bleeding during the wedding ceremony? All sorts of things. They don't. But now what Levi-Strauss says is that the reason they don't is because the architecture of the human brain forbids it. And I'm just thinking, when I read all this, I thought, hang on a bit. I've got a human brain, you've got a human brain. I can easily think of anything happening. I can easily just make a story up myself, and all the wrong things happen. I mean, why not? Why can't Jack go up the beanstalk and find lots and lots of food on each leaf? He's got up the beanstalk. Why doesn't he eat stuff? Why does he have to be hungry? Is it because of the nature of the human brain? I remember just thinking this is just not very likely. So I'm going to go back to Jack and the Beanstalk because, you know, I find it the simplest way to explain the bird nest myth. So we know we have two versions of Jack and the Beanstalk. The earliest known published edition appeared in London in 1734 under the title Enchantment Demonstrated in the Story of Jack Spriggins and the Enchanted Bean. Now that's the earliest version, but it's not the one we all know about when we go to pantomime. That one is a later thing, published first. The first copy we have is 1807, and it's a six-penny booklet called The History of Jack and the Beanstalk. So, right, the earlier version is significant in that it is the earliest known one, and it has some details which are interesting. Now, remember I talked about incest. That's in the bird nest myth. Tell me what you think about this. You're told that although Jack was a smart, large boy, nevertheless, quote, his grandmother and he laid together, and between whiles the good old woman instructed Jack in many things. It sounds a bit naughty, don't you think? The woman says to her grandson, Jack, says she, as you are a comfortable bedfellow to me. What? Grandmother talking to her grandson, you are a comfortable bedfellow to me. I must tell you that I have a bean in my house, which will make your fortune. Well, I mean, this is really, I don't know, scandalous, isn't it? The old woman accidentally loses the bean from her purse. It falls into the ashes of the hearth where the cat finds it just as Jack is making his grandmother's fire. So Jack wants to make the fire, but it doesn't quite work out that way. Odds buds, says Jack with his bean. I'll set it in our garden and see what it will come to, for I always love beans and bacon. And then what was wonderful, the bean was no sooner put into the ground, but the sprout of it jumped out of the earth and grew so quickly that it gave Jack a fillip on the nose and made him bleed furiously. What? The bean makes him bleed from the nose, right? Bleeding furiously from his nose, Jack runs to his grandmother crying, save me, I am killed. She tells him that now her enchantment will be broken in 1 hour's time, whereupon she will be transformed. Angry at Jack's theft of her bean, she tries to thrash him, but he escapes up the beanstalk, which is now a mile high. As her hour expires, the old woman turns into a monstrous toad and crawls into a cellar on her way to the shades. Meanwhile, Jack climbs and climbs. Now, what I do know is that Levi-Strauss is right about hunger. If you're moving into the other world, and especially if you're bleeding, when you think about it, don't forget these stories come from a very long time in the past when we used to be hunters and gatherers. And we would catch animals and bring back the meat home, and then as long as it was bleeding and raw, this is the raw and the cooked theme of Levi-Strauss, you can't eat it. Not because you could eat it, there's nothing wrong with blood, it's quite nutritious, but there's a very powerful taboos against eating raw meat with the blood in it in so many traditional cultures. So what do you do to the meat to make it culturally edible? How do you remove the visible blood from the meat? You stick it in the fire. It's been in the fire for a few minutes, maybe half an hour, you take it out, look inside. Is there some blood in it? Oh my God, there's some blood in the meat. Well, you put it back again. Only when all the visible blood has been removed from the meat is it properly cooked and therefore rendered available as food. Any blood is like the reverse of cooking. Now, if you're cooking meat while bleeding, that's not going to work, is it? I mean, you don't want to be menstruating while you're cooking, not bleeding in any form while cooking meat, because you want to remove the blood from the meat. You don't want to put more blood into it. That's going to make it even more raw than it was before. So can you see what's happening here? there's going to be hunger because you can't eat the meat. Now, this is just so brilliant, this version of Jack and the Beanstalk, but it brings it all out. Jack's climbing up the beanstalk, bleeding from the nose. He calls at an inn in a town and one of the beanstalks leaves. Here he thought to rest for a time and goes strutting like a crow in a gutter. You don't have crows move in a gutter. It's a beautiful image. Swaggering around from foot to foot. What have you to eat, landlord, says he. Oh, everything in the world, sir, says the landlord. Why then, says Jack, give me a neck of mutton and broth. Oh, alas, says the landlord, tomorrow's market day. How unfortunate it is. I cannot get you a neck of mutton tonight if it was to save my soul. Well then, get me something else, says Jack. Have you any veal? No, indeed, sir, not at present. But there's a fine calf fatting at Mr. Jenkinson's that will be killed on Saturday next. But have you any beef in your house, says Jack? Why, truly, sir, says the landlord. If you had been here on Monday last, I believe, though I said that I should not say it, you never saw so fine a sirloin of beef as we had, and plum pudding too, which the justice who dined here, and their clerks and constables, entirely demolished. And though I got nothing by them, yet the company was a great credit to my house. Zounds, said Jack. Have you nothing in the house? I am hungry. I am starving. Jack hears a cock crowing and demands that this be killed and broiled. The landlord refuses because the cock belongs to the squire. Jack asks for a hen to be killed, but all the hens are incubating eggs, which should hatch in a week. Have you no eggs in the house, says Jack. No, sir, indeed, answers the landlord, but just eggs, which we make of chalk. Why then, says Jack, what the devil have you got? Why, to tell you the truth, sir, I don't know that I have anything in the house to eat. It's making a point, isn't it? There's no food around when you're in the other world, especially if you're bleeding. So, okay, so we need to explain these things. What do I do next? Levi-Strauss is absolutely determined not to go down the road that I would go down, or that any materialist would go down, or anybody that thinks the body is kind of important and the mind is reflects things in the body. So, for that reason, he won't do the kind of obvious thing. Right. You know, I read it out from Levi-Strauss. He says, myths are the mind communing idly with itself. In mythology, you're just, the mind is just talking to itself. Actually, it reminds me of Noam Chomsky, who says, language came in a sudden miraculous moment, whereupon the first person to speak began talking to itself. There's this strange idea. You've got to magnify the significance of mind over matter, the mind over the body. Now, in real life, things aren't like that. In real life, myths are connected, like the other world, if you like, the world of mythic narrative is connected to this practical world through a genuine rope, which is ritual performance, because the rituals are myths acted out. You act out the celestial beings on this earth through performance. And across the world, until quite recently, and certainly among hunter-gatherers to this day, the most important rituals are what we call initiation, because the way in which the moral values and structures and culture of any community gets passed from generation to generation. It doesn't just happen. You don't just let it happen. Young kids sort of vaguely learn what their parents do. No, no, no. You initiate the kids. You take the kids and you put them through an experience. And in Africa, among hunter-gatherers, particularly what we call immediate return hunter-gatherers, which tend to be gender egalitarian, the most important rituals, and this certainly applies to the Kalahari Sun, but many others as well, are actually the girls' initiation rituals. So a girl comes of age. What's the sign that she's come of age? She bleeds. And what happens is that there's a big ceremony to celebrate the fact that she's showing fertility. And we call it, it's a first menstruation ceremony, but it's also, of course, a girl's initiation ritual. It's initiation in the sense that this girl actually comes of age. She joins the community of women. And that's a very powerful experience, which she won't forget. Of course, boys also have initiation rituals, not always as important as the girls' initiation rituals, although, of course, in other cultures, more hierarchical cultures, they may be much more important. But when the boys go through their initiation, they, surprisingly perhaps, you'll find that they also have to bleed. And they bleed from the nose, from the ears, maybe from the penis, maybe from the arm, but some kind of male shedding of blood is needed to signify and create the experience of becoming initiated. And the whole experience of initiation is experienced as a kind of death, because to be initiated is to be twice born. You're born, you grow up, 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old, whatever. When you go through an initiation rite, it's as if you've died, kind of gone back into the womb, and very, very explicitly that the experiences of initiation are those of going back into a great womb and then coming out again and being born like a second time. The story of the bird nester. Look at it now. The story of the bird nester, of course, we know that it's about initiation, don't we? Because it begins that way. A woman is collecting palms to make a penis sheath for her son, and her son takes advantage of her and rapes her. And sort of what happens in the rest of the story is that his initiation is a consequence of that. So he goes into the land of the dead, and he comes out with magical power. I don't think it's all that difficult, is it, to see the whole of that story as a description of the experience of going into the land of the dead and coming out powerful. And of course, the critical point about initiation is that it's really the opposite of marriage. I mean, we often, people who don't know much about hunter-gatherers are not, but anthropologists, yeah, all cultures have marriage, have weddings. Hunter-gatherers, yeah, of course, people get together and it's acknowledged socially, and there's an element of commitment builds up. But hunter-gatherers don't have weddings in the sense that we think of them, where a priest or somebody makes them say, I choose this woman and till death do you part. Like a man has conjugal rights in his wife. Hunter-gatherers do bride service. A young man will have, if he wants a sexual relationship, he's got to go prove himself to be a hunter, and he's got to prove himself to be a generous hunter and bring meat to his in-laws. And he has to keep on doing it. And in a bride service society, bride service, don't forget, it's not bride price. A young man has to provide for his sweetheart, if you like, and her mum and other relatives. As soon as he shows himself to be lazy or useless, he's out. He goes back again. So there's no a man doesn't have conjugal rights. So in that sense, you don't have a wedding, but they do have initiation as the condition of even being able to do this before, like usually with a boy. It's his first kill. He makes his first kill of a large animal, and that kind of is his initiation. But of course, there's a ceremony around it as well. I'm not quite sure I can find the space here, and where I have all this. Just trying to look. It's just that when all right, I'll leave it. When Levi-Strauss says, I don't know. He's desperate to cut the myths away from life. So what he says is that myths are digital, structured, sort of intelligence. Ritual, he says, is a bastard. And you might think, why am I using that word? It's because it's the word he uses. Ritual is the bastardization of thought. Now, what his complaint is, he says, look, there are rituals where everything's wrong. So let's explain all that, to tease it out. He has a theory about the origins of culture, a theory about the transition in the evolutionary past from nature to culture, from nature to we humans who have language, culture, music, religion, all those things, that transition. And he says, there are rituals which mix everything up. So for him, the transition from nature to culture is separating males from females, establishing a rule against incest, and doing that in order to make a categorical distinction between humans and animals. So you have male, female, human, animal, all these things nicely distinguished. And then he says, hey, ritual, it just muddles everything up. He says, you get these shamans, and they've got antlers. Okay, they're mixing up human and animal. You've got these shamans, they're cross-dressing. They're like females, but they're supposed to be males. So that's all wrong. So he finds all these rituals all wrong. And the reason he knows they're wrong is because his theory doesn't match what he finds in the ritual. So instead of coming across all the rituals, I think maybe my theory is wrong, which he ought to have done, he thinks, no, it's the rituals which are wrong, and he calls them a bastard. And of course, when he just thinks, why did he use that word? Well, of course, from a patriarchal standpoint, a bastard is somebody who's like mixed up with his daddies. And it could have been anyone, she could have had sex with anyone, or it's a bastard. You can see how deeply patriarchal Levi-Strauss's assumptions are as he approaches all these things. So when it comes to the macaw feathers in the story, he won't connect them to the rituals. But we know from other sources, and I'm thinking particularly of Terence Turner. I wish I'll probably find it before we have a discussion. Terence Turner, in his own discussion of the initiation rituals of boys in roughly the same area, not quite the same tribe, the Bororo, but we know how widespread these patterns are. The macaw's feathers are these bright red feathers, which it's not just that during a boys' initiation ritual, everyone has to wear the feathers. The men and the boys turn into macaws. They flap their wings, they make noises like macaws, they turn into macaws, and they will say, if you ask them, we are macaws. And it's kind of a metaphor, but it's like a realized metaphor. We really are macaws while we are undergoing initiation. And then, of course, all the mythology about these red feathers is that they come from the moon's blood or the blood of some other creature, and all sorts of amplification of that basic idea. So I've got to finish in a minute. The reality is these myths have their structure, not, in my view, because of the architecture of the human brain. Because when we did become human, what happened was, I don't want to go through the whole argument, but what happened was that evolving human females needed to be able to establish what was really the basic rule of culture, kind of like the incest taboo, but in some ways more fundamental. And that's the simple idea that women needed at the beginning of time. No means no. We don't accept rape. If a son, father, man, approaches us and we don't want him, we link up with each other, put on a ceremony. Ideally, we can just laugh the guy out of court because he's making such an idiot of himself. But if need be, we draw on support from our sons and brothers and indicate no means no. Now that is a form of resistance to chaos, which involves collectivism. And clearly, as young girls come of age, they have to be initiated into that logic that no means no. And there are reasons why the most likely time to signal no is during the period of menstruation, using the blood of menstruation to mark the body as sacred. And we've gone into this earlier, last term, but also I'm sure it'll come out again. So, okay, so in the myths which describe, as I've been mentioning, first we're alive, then there's a flow of blood, and we go into the other world. And that other world is a world of darkness, rawness, wetness, all those things. Can you see what's really going on? All the myths, and actually Levi-Strauss has to admit this in his work. He kind of finds a bit awkward about it. It's not his theory really, but he kind of has it. He concedes with all sorts of detail that the myths are saying this. Women die temporarily. Menstruation is a form of death, but it's death like the death of the moon. You come back from the dead. The moon dies and comes alive again, and women bleed, and women's bleeding is a little death. It's a temporary death. But while women are temporarily dead, they're secluded. What does seclusion mean? It means you keep away from male contact. Women are with their own blood, with each other, therefore with their sons. Note that story, how it begins. It's saying that what we're saying is that women with their sons essentially on sex right, saying no means no. Of course, they're not going to be having sex with their sons. This is actually a resistance to sex, and they'd be drawing on their male kin to defend themselves. But of course, when patriarchy comes along and has to find excuses for overthrowing that whole system, it accuses women, as in this story, oh, you can't even control your own sons. You know, when you're with them, they rape you. That's clearly an ideological assertion used in order to justify, you know, a change of social structure. Now, the last part of it is just this. The reason why the land of the dead, if you like, has these features is because you can just work out what those features are. They're the features of going into menstrual seclusion. When you're in menstrual seclusion in any of these cultures, you're in the dark. One of the most famous statements to describe what has to happen to a girl when she bleeds. The sun may not shine on her head, nor her feet touch the ground. She has to be between heaven and earth. She can't be in this world. She's in seclusion. And of course, there's no cooking. Of course, there's no food. Of course, she's on a kind of diet. She eats special food. She's kind of fasting while in seclusion. And all these things go together. The seclusion, the wetness, this kinship intimacy, all those things come together. Just as when she comes out of seclusion, she's no longer a sister or a mother to her son. She now comes out. She metamorphoses into the opposite kinship identity. She's now in a relationship of wife, not sister. Cooking, not raw. The cook, not the raw. All those features of these myths, which Levi-Strauss argues are kind of universal. They're echoes, if you like, of this basic structure where women would use their menstrual blood and each other's blood, and augmented, of course, with cosmetics such as ochre, in order to signal this fundamental thing, which is, again, for me, actually, it's like saying I'm not very religious, although I was brought up a Catholic, but all the world's religions have one thing which is very important, which is this idea that some things are sacred. And the body really has to be sacred. If the body isn't sacred, nothing is. And women need that more than men, because men are better at some things than women are. And I'm thinking of violence. I mean, if the world was about violence, if the way to get ahead was to use violence, men will be better at it than women. But of course, as we became human with our systems of morality, our language, our culture, and so on, violence was no longer, as a result of that transition, the way to get ahead. There were other ways of establishing your status in society, apart from violence. So, but the idea that some things are sacred is absolutely critical, and it was done that way. And these stories kind of echo that. And okay, then just perhaps the last bit of it. I mean, today, looking around the world, it's all a bit sad, I think. I don't know. We're in a bit of a mess. The planet seems to be disintegrating, all these different tribes, all these different wretched fundamentalisms and nationalisms. What is still inspiring about Levi-Strauss's work is this, that he was the first to convincingly show us that all the world's magical myths and fairy tales are variations on a theme. As he puts it at the end, the last part of it, the last chapter of the last volume of mythology, he said, in the end, we have one myth only. So he's really saying that planet Earth, to this day, is embraced by this fabric of mythology, like one myth right around the world, showing that actually all the world's religions are, at bottom, one. They all have the same source. Okay? They come from the same place, the same basic ritual tradition. And for me, that's always been an inspiration. No one's done that better than Levi-Strauss, except that somehow, yeah, he kind of, because his politics was strange and his sexist ideology was strange, he never quite worked out what that ultimate myth is all about. And so although the moon comes up a lot and menstruation comes up an enormous amount, it's sort of despite his theory. And there's no need for that. If we just have the courage to break that taboo, which is more powerful actually within Western science than it is in any traditional society. The taboo on talking about menstruation of the moon as relevant to human history. If we have the courage to break that taboo and get to the secret of all these things, we can gain a glimpse of this universal property of being human, this feature of being human that we all share and which we can find information about from the world's myths as from no other source. So that's it.
Okay, Chris, thank you so much for taking us through those stories. They're amazing. There would be many more bird nesters to talk about on different continents, because I've got some bird nester stories from Hadza people. And Eleanor, you're here as well. You can tell us something about that. And from Australia, and we're going to hear more mythology from Australia. But let's focus on the fairy tale and the Bororo story tonight. Any questions, people in the room, or any questions on Zoom? If you want to raise your hand or wave at me. Questions, comments, anything? Rory, what I say?
The idea of like the taboo of eating meat whilst it's bloody. Does that have any link to the idea, like, to raw meat being unscientific and killing you? Is there anything about that?
So the question, if you didn't hear on Zoom, is about the idea of eating meat as bloody, and is that linked to raw meat being like unsanitary and unhealthy? Yeah, Chris, do you want to say? Yeah, you need to be on camera.
I don't think so, to be honest. I mean, chimpanzees eat raw meat quite happily. They eat monkeys while they're still alive and sort of kill them by eating them. And so do other carnivores. I don't think that kind of materialism really works. So my own view is very different. Just think of kosher. Think of the laws of Lazarus. Think of I don't know. All the world's religions seem to have ideas about what you do with animals when you kill them. And as far as I can work out, the idea is that you can kill, but not to eat. So you may kill an animal for God to make a sacrifice, maybe for your in-laws to offer up the meat, but to simply use violence for your own good, to shed blood and eat the bloody meat like the way chimpanzees do, that's almost the core sin at the root of the world's religions. So, I mean, again, we need to go into it a little bit more at some other point, but my own view is that to use Levi-Strauss's word, it's like the spirit of the gift. Bloody meat must be given. Your sister must be given. You mustn't consume your own flesh, your own blood. And there are reasons why women manage to get men to understand that they can use violence, but when they do use violence, they mustn't use it against each other, against children or against women. In Africa, the pressure would be to go away. Yes, we know that hunting is violence. Kill a zebra, come back. You want sex? Well, come back with a zebra, and we'll think about it. But as I put by the way, in my first book, Blood Relations, Menstruation and the Origins of Culture, the first few chapters are about what I call the own kill rule, the hunter's own kill rule. Like the lowest man in the community is the man who kills an animal and just eats it. So halal, kosher, all those things are about how when you kill an animal, you must make an offering of it, not eat it while it's, and of course with hunter-gatherers, the offering means you give it to your in-laws, and they alone have the right to be the women who have custodianship of the fire and be in a position to use that fire to remove the, if you like, the pollution of the blood. Which, by the way, in another whole part of the theory, of course, is that blood is then linked to menstruation in ways which I invite you to explore, but it's too much to talk about here.
Manchego, do you want to go?
Yes, we've been having on the same subject, we've been having a pretty long discussion here about the blood and all that. And I pointed out that African herders, they rarely kill an animal. What
Yeah.
they'll do is they take the blood and they mix it with milk and they just eat it there. And it was pointed out by one of us, I can't remember which one at the moment, and they're not up here, that it comes out, that blood comes out hot. So it's, you know, it's already cooked apparently in the animal. So I don't know if that is a good interpretation or not, but I thought it was
But I
interesting.
think it's already cooked. Yeah, I mean, the point is the animal's not killed. You're just borrowing a bit of its blood, and that's
Right.
the rule is you don't kill, you don't use violence and shed blood to kill in order to eat yourself. But just borrowing a bit of blood from the animal, yeah, I mean, that's kind of different thing. And I mean, obviously, I mean, it'd be ridiculous to say that all the world's religions are the same. And perhaps I should have stressed that more with Levi-Strauss. Levi-Strauss is not saying, when he says one myth only, he's definitely not saying we've just got one myth. That would be so boring. What he's looking for is like a common standard of measurement of all the world's myths. It's rather like saying, can I just say this because I need to explain it. It's not in direct response to the question here, but it's like, Levi-Strauss is not saying all the world's myths are just the same. He's saying, if imagine you're trying to look at different buildings as an architect, and you've got metric in one case, you've got feet and inches in another, you've got some other standard with furlongs in some other. He's just saying, you don't know where you are. In order to be able to tell the difference between the buildings in terms of their scale and size and so on, you need a common standard of measurement. Just use meters, for example, and centimeters. So he's saying, in order to understand just precisely how the different myths, vary, how they differ from one another, you need some common picture of what's behind them all. So then you can measure those differences. So he's interested not in sameness, but in a same underlying structure, which of course, as I mentioned, he thinks it's the architecture of the brain. But I mean, the point is, as I say, more than anyone else, he did show us how to connect the myths through their differences. It's like you have simple mathematical operations which you can perform on these myths to turn them inside out, left to right, various other operations on them to show how they're different from something which you hold in common. And without that common basis, you wouldn't know where you are, and you just get a headache as you look at all the different myths. You don't know where you are. Just see one myth and then another and another, and before long you can't remember anything, and you're just defeated by it all. Levi-Strauss shows us how to relate the myths to each other. So, and again, what I'm trying to say is, it'd be ridiculous to say all the world's rituals are the same. But having said that, hunter-gatherers don't have weddings, and they do have initiation, and there are common features between those rituals of initiation, which I argue account for the underlying structures of world mythology.
Any more questions here? I was going to just ask you to elaborate about the noise, because you were pulling out noise in many of the stories in Jekyll and the Beanstalk and in the Bororo story. But what about that? How can we link that in? I think when you were bringing the terms together at the end, can we say a bit more about?
Well, okay, yes. I mean,
noise.
First of all, you get loud bangs and crashes in the other world, and it's just one of those. This is just a fact. I haven't explained it, but it's just a fact. We have these noise-making instruments in these stories, these rattles which make a noise. In Aboriginal Australia, of course, you have the bull roarer. You have the woo 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 sound, and it's very clear from the myths associated with the bull roarer and the way in which the bull roarers are used in ritual that this woo 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 sound is something we've all heard before when we were in the womb of a mother. It's like the sound of a heart pump, the sound of the pulse, the sound of the beating of the mother's heart. So I suppose a simple way of saying it is that supposing you wanted to have a nice, peaceful bit of romantic sex with your partner, What do you want? Woo, 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 going on all around you. No. Supposing you wanted to break up couples, you think, hang on a bit, you're all having sex. No, 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 come on, we've got to organize. Girls, go, come on, we've got to give these guys a message. Come on, no more sex until they've got a zebra. And now you say, whoa, 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 whoa. That might work. So the noise is so the noise is the sort of, I mean, the blood is a loud signal visually. It's a very loud, striking color, which is a shocking color. And then if you want to add to the color of blood, the sound it makes, then you've got all these rattles and bullroarers and trumpets and things. The trumpet, by the way, the sacred trumpets, they make a huge farting sound. They're not like what we think. Well, of course, a trumpet does that. You have to sort of purse your lips and do a raspberry into a trumpet if you're a trumpet player. But these are not exactly music. They're not exactly harmony. They cause tension and make it difficult to relax, which may be what you want.
And in relation to, for instance, girls' first menstruation, there is a lot of these so-called noise-making instruments. They're instruments of darkness. So
Yes,
in the
yeah,
Levi-Strauss.
And wherever men have these noise-making instruments, these trumpets, these bullroarers, they always have a myth. We stole these things from women. So the bullroarer came from women, and she kept it up her vagina, which was a hiding place for the bullroarer. You know, and at some point, some male hero, oh, what a hero, and he meant to steal it. But the trumpets, bullroarers, I mean, there's no exception to that, by the way. These male instruments of darkness, as Levi-Strauss calls them, these trumpets and sacred noise-making instruments, they're all associated with the men's house, the men's cult, with male initiation. And there's not an exception to this rule that the boys are told these things once belonged to women. We have robbed them from women. It's just everywhere. And of course, anthropologists, being not very imaginative people very often, oh yeah, it's just interesting, isn't it, how myths always turn the world upside down. Whatever's the opposite of what happens now is going to be in a myth. And that's not a very profound thought. It's far more than just playing around with patterns. There are reasons why all the world's myths about the origin of these noise-making instruments attribute them to women. And it's because women were the first to establish them, that their bodies are sacred, making a lot of noise.
Any questions, comments? Anyone on Zoom would like to chip in some more? No? Oh, Eloise.
But it just, I still don't understand why, so you were saying seclusion can be woman with like the child. Is it what it means, like, why does it start with an incest? Or why does the man that rapes his mother go to the land? Like, why this is like why incest specifically?
Can you just clarify for Zoom?
Yes. So was that yes. Yeah, sorry. I mean, yes. I've skipped so many stages in the argument that I'm not surprised that it doesn't add up all very well. So why would a story about a young man raping his mother who's fetching a penis sheath for him, why would that relate to all the myths which say that women once had power and went into menstrual seclusion, and there was some experience of solidarity in that, given that these myths are sort of saying the opposite? Is that kind of what you're arguing? Yeah. Well, all I can say is that the world was turned upside down by men around most of the world, and so we just get opposite messages being transmitted. I mean, okay, so as I was mentioning, whenever men go through male initiation, as I mentioned, they in order to prove their commitment to the male you know, to the community into which they're being initiated, they have to bleed. And okay, and the men say, and it's particularly clear in Aboriginal Australia when you have sub-incision, where the men, in order to be initiated, the boys placed on their back on a table made of other men kneeling down, and the initiator takes their penis, pulls it back, and there's a sharp stone, and puts it into the urethral canal, right deep, and rips out the whole penis, and it all sprays out with a huge amount of blood. Very, very, very painful. And they say this is us menstruated, and we need to menstruate because all sacred power comes from blood, menstrual blood. I mean, it's very hard for us to relate to that. I do agree. But don't forget the circumcision, there's a version of that. All sorts of other forms of initiation are versions of that. I mentioned Jack and the Beanstalk, the nosebleed. In Papua New Guinea, what is it called? The High Valley, was it Richard Reed, was it? Anyways, Highland Papua New Guinea. How do boys prove they're real men? Well, what you do, you have a huge, you have a kind of a bank. All the men are watching. The boy very, very bravely comes up to full view of everybody, and he has this very sharp grass, and he puts it up his nostrils, and it goes right up his nostrils and down into his throat, and he goes like this. And it's, I mean, it's hard to stay standing. It's so painful, you can imagine. And he pours with blood from his nose. So I think Jack and the Beanstalk was a Cornish version of that, probably, because it's got this nosebleed in it. So can you see how, I mean, okay, when I first learned about this, it was here. It was a lecture given by Mary Douglas. I think it was in 1978. And she was talking about how all over the world, men use, the book she was talking about was The Island of Menstruating Men, the Wageo Islanders. You can get it, I'm sure you can get it, and the Island of Menstruating, Ian Hogbin. And the Island of Menstruating Men, she was describing how sometimes men feel a bit, I don't know, lethargic, a little, don't have any energy, a bit tired, they're not very, they want some energy, and so they want to get. So what you do is you go to the edge of the island, you go to the water, you take a big sharp shell, you lift up your penis, you scratch it all up with, and you bleed all over the place, and you break all the water all full of blood. And you do this at new moon. And once your penis is covered in blood, you're not going to be having sex with a woman. And the argument is that having sex with women means you lose your energy. I mean, it's nice to have sex with a woman, according to we'll go after this, but it's not good for your spiritual power or your real potency. So you do this menstruation stuff to keep apart from the opposite sex. And then as you come back from the shore, you're feeling energized, it's strong, and so that's what you do.
So Met turned the sex strike against.
So
women.
that not having sex with women, there's a whole book on that called Muelos, by the way. There's another thing, is the idea that men, when you have sex, you lose your brain, because your head is like a huge bone inside of which is the muelos, the marrow. And so semen is brain marrow, skull marrow. You don't want to give it to women. You want to hold it to yourself. If the women have it, you're giving them your power. So, I mean, that's another whole axis of all this. So I'm just saying, I don't think any of this can be understood without understanding that things started out one way round and then turned it the other way round when men found that they, whatever reason that, I mean, we can go into the reasons, there are reasons why when men had to do the menstruating, things went pear-shaped.
Just, did you want to?
Why is the incest the thing?
Right, thank you, sorry, yeah, very good question, yeah. Okay, so there's different theories to the origin of the incest taboo. I mean, it's clear that incest isn't too good over a long period of time. The genes need to be spread around, and if too much inbreeding isn't all that good, but it's not sufficiently harmful for it to explain this extraordinarily strong taboo on incest that all human cultures have. It's like, if you have sex with your sister, if you're an older brother and you have sex with your sister, the likelihood is the baby will be fine. But in no culture do women allow it. And it's not just about incest within the nuclear family, it's also about how the fact is that in traditional hunter-gatherer cultures, this taboo applies much more widely. It's called exogamy. You know, a whole bunch of, if you're a young man, a whole bunch of women are categorized as your sisters, and you mustn't have sex with them. And so Levi-Strauss has an explanation, and it's called the exchange of women. He thinks that men established the incest taboo. How do they do it? Why do they do it? It's because you had a group of men over here, and they were having sex with their own sisters and daughters. So you have males who are selfish, holding on to their females, having sex with them, and another group of men do the same over there. And then one day, thanks to the brain becoming digital, or thanks, he doesn't quite say thanks to what really, these men had the, oh, if we were to give our sisters and daughters to those men, and if those men would then in return make a gift to their sisters and daughters, then we'd have a relationship between us men. So women are the sort of instruments of men's sort of bargaining relationships. Who believes in that thing? That men invented the incest taboo. As soon as you think about it, you just realize that it's women who suffer from incest. Women can only have a few babies. So if there are genetic consequences, for a man, who cares? You can have 100,000 babies by having sex. You have sex with your sister, and then another one. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, we know that among chimpanzees, the female chimpanzees don't like being approached sexually by their sons and fathers and brothers. They're the ones who resist. So, I mean, on any Darwinian basis, the idea that men invented the incest taboo just does not add up. It must have been women who invented the incest taboo. So that's what I think that women needed to be able to signal no, draw in their sons and brothers as part of their coalition in order to signal no, and in the course of boys growing up with their mothers, asserting this rule that coercive sex isn't allowed, the boys identify with their mothers, and of course within the coalition, those boys aren't going to be able to have sex with their mothers and sisters. This myth, of course, is an extremely patriarchal myth. And so it starts out with the accusation, women can't do it. Women can't measure up. Look, this woman was raped by her own son. Women can't do it. Women can't maintain the incest taboo. We men will have to do it for them. So these patriarchal myths are doing that they're justifying turning everything upside down so that men have to menstruate, men have to impose the incest taboo and so on. And of course, Levi-Strauss kind of goes along with that because he thinks men invented cooking, men invented menstruations, menstrual synchrony with the moon, everything. Levi-Strauss says everything of culture was a male invention. Men and culture, women and nature. Culture has to dominate nature. Women therefore have to be dominated by men. So Levi-Strauss internalizes the ideological message of these myths, which I just think is, it's not just sort of, I don't know, politically unpleasant. It means you can't make sense of the stories, in my view. And he details the stories, but you never get a feeling that he never even really tells you what this ultimate myth is. He never really clarifies what this elementary structure, this deep structure behind all the world's myths is. He's unable to spell it out, which is obviously a big problem. One of the reasons why Levi-Strauss lost all his influence is because people read through these 4 volumes and just thought, well, where are we? I mean, he ends up with this rather pathetic conclusion, to be or not to be. I mean, it's just that's what the myths are saying, to be or not to be, and it's just like it's feeble.
Whilst also being incredibly accurate about the structures.
Yeah, so it's such a paradox. Some part of me won't have a word said against Levi-Strauss because it's so clever and so scholarly and so conscientious and so detailed. He does let all the details of the stories come out. It's just that when he tries to explain them, I mean, he just fails rather tragically. So I mean, that's actually.
I'd just like to mention that the very first story that I heard when I went to visit Hadza was exactly a bird nester story. In fact, it was a Hadza version of Jack and the Beanstalk, pretty much, with a husband, well, with the hero being an old ogress woman called Wawilak. And we've been learning even more stories about Wawilak just recently from Eleanor. But she had a giant millet field, and she was supposed to have died and been buried, and her daughter with the husband went away because she died. But then they visited again the grave, which is a very un-Hadza thing to do, and she'd come back to life again with all these incredible millets growing right up to so beanstalks really. And she sends her son-in-law up a baobab, making for some birds that are in the nest, in the hole. And as he's climbing, he makes the pegs that Hadza hunters put into the trunks, the baobabs, and he's trying to grasp these little chicks and throw. So just when you had in the story that all these things about the birds that are carrying off, and he grasps these birds and throws them down to and what he's trying to do is she is actually eating. This ogress mother-in-law is eating his shins as he's going up, and so he throws down the birds to make her run after the birds and enable him to come right down. Now in Hadza initiation for young men, which they do after first kill, when they've killed an epimate animal, there is indeed a it's funny, they call it fake. They describe it as fake nosebleed. But how can you make a fake nosebleed until you actually make a nosebleed? It's like, so that is the blood that's happening.
So they hadn't bagged on the nose.
Something happens, yeah. So it's a bit mysterious, but exactly. But yeah, they're doing a nosebleed as well. So there's a lot of obviously connections. But what's quite interesting in the bird nester versions, and there's another bird nester called Dagweko, is a Wawilak Dagweko one, is that it is, instead of a father and son, it is a mother and a daughter as a team who then become potentially antagonistic to each other. So it's kind of female intergenerational antagonism instead of but the same format. So I think maybe people want to wrap up because we've got to let people through. You're all trapped here. We want to let you through. We'll make sure you get out. Next week, there was anything on Zoom, any more queries or anything, but I think we've heard from people's questions. So next week, Chris is going to take us through the stories of the Australian Aboriginal rainbow snake, which should help, again, to solidify some of the themes that you've been hearing tonight.
Just say, when I read Levi-Strauss's bird nester myths, and he says this myth, the bird nester, is found in Amazonia among the Bororo, and then he goes up to the northwest coast of the United States, the Klamath River area, and finds, guess what? A bird nester is almost the same. So when I read it, I thought, oh, I just went to the library and got a little book by somebody called Robinson, Aboriginal Australian Myths, and I opened it up. And the first thing I looked at was, my God, it's a bird nester. I mean, really, it was so stunning. So I'll mention those Australian Aboriginal versions and hopefully be able to fill in some of the gaps. I mean, I really apologize for having covered probably too much, tried to cover too much this evening, and probably some huge gaps were left unexplained. And so maybe, we'll make it all make sense a little bit more, make more sense.
I think next week's talk should give more help to support Scaffold this week as well. So thank you very much for making it here tonight. And then we better say thanks to Chris for the fantastic talk. Thank you. And thank you so much to everybody on Zoom for joining us. And I hope you can make it back next week. Just to say, if you joined Eventbrite, through the registration, you know, if you know the Zoom ID, you don't actually need to register. Same with people tonight, you don't need to register, you get the details. The reason for that is Eventbrite is only giving us 25 places as a free listing. So leave those places to newbie people who don't know the details is the best thing. But basically, we're going to be doing the same thing next week with the clambering through from the other side, and that's going to be for the next few weeks through February.
Yeah, really nice.
For those of you who want to have a quick drink,
yeah,
we go to the Tavistock Hotel downstairs, just over there, 5 minutes away.
have we got a card too? Rory has a card. Can Rory open the door? Is he there? Is he gone? Okay. Did he go? Have you got just?
I put the card there.
You picked it up, just so Mark can pick it up and open that door for people. I'm just going to say bye to everybody on Zoom. Thank you very much. Lovely to see you, Frederic. Very nice to see you join.
Frederic,
Everything. Yeah, Frederic. Excellent. Bye then. We're going.
Bye, thanks Camilla. Bye
Bye.
Chris.
See you
Take care.
next week. Camilla.
Bye.
Bye.